Fairmont Crest, tragedies rarely begin with gunshots or a door being kicked open. More often, they arrive as fleeting images, encounters witnessed at the wrong moment, messages with no explanation. Silences that last a little too long between two people who once believed they understood each other better than anyone else. There are mistakes that do not kill love instantly, but poison it little by little until a person can no longer tell whether what is beating inside their chest is trust, fear, or fury. This time, the center of that spiral is Jacob, Naomi, and Donnie. But behind it all lies more than a marriage beginning to crack or a mother worrying too much about her daughter. It is the shadow of an illegal plasma trafficking network, the name Plasma King hanging in the air like a threat without a face. The sickening feeling that anyone who gets too close to the truth could vanish before they even understand what they have touched. Thank you for taking the time to watch my video, and thank you for your trust. All the content I create is purely speculative and based on personal experience. If you find the video interesting and helpful, please support me with a like and a comment. Naomi had lived with anxiety for so long that fear had begun to reshape the structure of her emotions. At first, she told herself it was only work pressure, the kind of distance any marriage might endure when a husband carries burdens he cannot bring home. But Jacob grew more guarded by the day, so guarded that he began to feel like a stranger. He disappeared at hours he could not explain, returned home with a rigid expression and eyes that always seemed to be scanning for some invisible danger over his shoulder. He spoke less, felt colder, and what hurt Naomi most was not the silence itself, but the sense that Jacob had begun living another life somewhere she could not enter. The harder she tried to understand him, the farther away he seemed to drift. The harder she tried to remain calm, the more she realized she was being eaten alive by the cruelest suspicion a marriage can suffer, not whether he still loved her. But what he was hiding that was so enormous he could accept turning her into a stranger. Jacob, however, saw everything from a completely different angle. In his eyes, every lie was a layer of armor. Every secret he kept was a way of keeping Naomi out of the line of fire. The problem was that men who believe they can protect the people they love through silence rarely understand that silence can be just as destructive as any bullet. Jacob had gone too deep into the plasma ring case. At first, it had seemed like only a dark operation, a network profiting from blood and the desperation of the vulnerable. But the deeper he went, the more he realized it was not an ordinary criminal organization. It ran on money, fear, and links that appeared scattered but were in fact connected by a mind cold enough to turn human beings into merchandise. The name Plasma King surfaced like a whisper among middlemen. No one mentioned it directly. No one dared hold eye contact for too long when speaking of it. The most terrifying thing was not that Jacob still did not know who that person was, but that he was beginning to feel manipulated. As though every step he took toward the truth had already been calculated in advance by someone else. To go deeper, Jacob had to accept a role that became more disgusting to him with every passing day. He had to let people believe he was a police officer desperate under the weight of debt, willing to bend the law for money. He had to meet intermediaries in filthy places and create the impression that his honor had rotted enough for him to be welcomed inside. Each time, he reminded himself this was the price of the mission, that if he endured a little longer, he would finally rip the mask off the network. But what Jacob could not control was the way that role began to leak into his real life. He was not only lying to criminals, he was lying to Naomi. He avoided her eyes, cut off her questions, hid his phone, changed his schedule, and turned the home that had once been his refuge into a place he entered like a man carrying hidden evidence. He still believed he had everything under control. That belief was the most dangerous thing of all. Dani entered the story not as a destroyer, but as a mother driven by a nearly savage instinct to protect. She had watched Naomi wear herself down for far too long. She had watched her daughter fade while waiting, while convincing herself that things would get better, that Jacob was merely going through a difficult period. Dani did not believe in vague reassurances. She believed in what her own eyes could see. And what she saw one seemingly harmless evening transformed all of her worrying into anger with a clear and brutal shape. At a motel outside the crowded part of town, Jacob appeared in utter secrecy with a woman who was not Naomi. There was no open display of affection, no gesture dramatic enough to condemn him on the spot, but it was that strained discretion that made the scene more suspicious than anything else. Jacob looked around before going inside. The woman kept just enough distance, as if they had rehearsed it. And for Donnie, that was more than enough to ignite her fury. Donnie's greatest mistake was believing that the truth always lay on the surface if a person were sharp enough to see it. She did not understand that in wars like this, the easiest thing to see is often the thing most carefully staged. From that moment on, Donnie's mind settled on only one conclusion. Jacob was betraying Naomi, maybe physically, maybe in loyalty. Maybe even worse, maybe he had fallen, been bought, been lured into the darkness spreading around the plasma ring case. The more she thought about it, the angrier she became. But beneath that fury was the primal fear of a mother who had seen too many women destroyed by trusting the wrong man. She did not want Naomi to become one of them. So instead of waiting, Donnie began to watch. She revisited every detail, every hour, every time Jacob appeared and disappeared, every sign Naomi had tried to ignore. The more she gathered, the more convinced she became. And the more convinced she became, the closer she moved toward a trap she did not even realize existed. Naomi did not know everything her mother had seen, but she could feel a dangerous shift. Dani was no longer merely worried. She had begun probing, baiting, emphasizing things that could keep a wife awake all night. At first, Naomi resisted. She wanted to defend her husband even when she herself was no longer certain what, exactly, she was defending. But once suspicion is given a name, it is very hard to make it invisible again. Jacob's secret meetings, his hollow explanations, his nights away, the way he touched his phone as if it were a bomb that might explode at any second, all of it began piling up. Naomi was angry at Jacob, but also disgusted with herself for still wanting to believe him. She felt insulted, not only by the possibility of betrayal, but by the sense that she was being treated like someone unworthy of knowing the truth about her own life. Inside Jacob, everything was cracking faster than he realized. A new lead made him believe Plasma King was no longer a distant shadow. The man might be watching those hunting him. He might already have sensed there was an undercover presence inside the system. A series of small signals began to appear. Meetings changed at the last minute. Locations switched at the final hour. Probing questions designed to test his reactions. Unfamiliar faces appearing and disappearing within his line of sight as though someone were counting every beat of his heart. Jacob understood something terrifying. He was no longer merely tracing the network. The network was tightening around him as well. But instead of retreating, he pushed deeper. Partly out of professional pride, partly because he believed he was too close to turn back. And most dangerously of all, he had begun to treat every personal loss as acceptable so long as the mission succeeded. That mindset was what led Jacob to fail in his marriage. He was no longer balancing the need to save the mission with the need to save his love. He began to assume Naomi simply had to endure, had to understand, had to wait, even though he gave her no foundation on which to keep trusting him. There were even moments when he deliberately acted colder than necessary, as if pushing Naomi away would somehow keep her safer. But he forgot that being pushed away from the truth does not make a person safe. It makes them desperate. And desperation often drives people toward the most dangerous choices of all. In the end, Donnie could no longer remain silent. She chose confrontation the way a mother does when she believes she is rushing in to save her child. Not with softness, but with a sharp, frozen rage that had built for far too long. She cornered Jacob in a moment when he had no time to prepare and threw everything at him. What she knew, what she had seen at the motel, what she believed he had been doing behind Naomi's back. It should have been the kind of moment that forced a guilty man to reveal himself. But what Donnie got in return was not the collapse of an adulterer, but the dangerous tension of a man whose darkest secret had just been touched. Jacob could not confess. But he also was not calm enough to erase her doubts. In Donnie's eyes, that hesitation looked exactly like proof. She left convinced she had seen Jacob's true nature. Jacob, meanwhile, understood that everything had begun slipping from his hands. Worse still, he had no idea whether that confrontation had been observed. In the world of the plasma ring, a single unusual movement, a meeting with the wrong person, an emotion expressed in the wrong place, was enough to shatter an entire cover. Jacob began to fear that Donnie had accidentally drawn other eyes toward him. And that fear stopped being hypothetical when a vague message reached him, not openly threatening, but cold enough to send a chill through his bones. They knew his private life had weaknesses. They knew he had something to lose. That meant Naomi was no longer outside the circle. Naomi now found herself trapped between two fires. On one side was Jacob, growing more suspicious by the day until even the tenderness still left in him felt frightening because it might only be temporary comfort. On the other side was Donnie, urging her to open her eyes, stop making excuses, and face the truth appearing right in front of her. Naomi did not want to become a blind wife. But she also did not want to become a woman who condemned her husband based on fragments of incomplete evidence. The conflict exhausted her. The deepest pain was not merely the fear that Jacob was cheating, but the possibility that if he was not betraying her in the ordinary sense, then what he was hiding was far worse. A cheating husband is painful enough. A husband walking beside death without telling his wife is something that crushed the soul. Then Naomi did the very thing Jacob feared most. She started looking for answers herself. No more waiting. No more begging for the truth to be handed to her like a privilege. She began following the leads Donnie had provided, the times Jacob vanished, the suspicious locations, the names with no clear origin. Naomi had never been trained for investigations like this, but her pain made her more reckless than she had ever imagined she could be. Every step she took came from two opposite needs, the need to prove Jacob innocent and the need to prepare herself for the worst. But in Plasma King's world, a desperate woman searching for her husband is not a harmless observer. She can become prey. Jacob realized Naomi was digging into the truth far too late. It was the first moment he truly understood he no longer controlled anything. Not the mission, not his cover, not his marriage. Everything was slipping away from the order he had foolishly convinced himself he still possessed. He understood that if he remained silent, Naomi might walk straight into the blade. But if he confessed too much, he could destroy the entire operation and allow the people behind the plasma ring to disappear into the shadows forever. This was no longer a question of whether he would save the mission first or save the woman he loved first. This was the moment he had to face the truth that it was his prolonged choice to remain silent that had created the very situation forcing him to choose. Meanwhile, Dani also began to waver in a way she did not want to admit. She discovered details that did not fit her simple theory of infidelity. The movements around Jacob were too professional, too tense, too much like a covert operation rather than a clumsy affair. There were times when Jacob looked exhausted in a way that did not resemble a man enjoying betrayal, but a man being eroded by invisible pressure. Dani was not someone who found it easy to admit she was wrong, especially when it involved the possibility that she herself might have pushed her daughter deeper into crisis. But the same instinct to protect Naomi was now forcing her to face an even worse possibility. What she saw at the motel might have been a perfect setup designed to trap someone exactly like her. To make Jacob's family destroy their own trust before the organization ever had to strike. That is what turned Plasma King into a true nightmare. Not because he had shown his face, but because he had not. An invisible enemy can still be hunted. A familiar face is far more dangerous because it means the network is not outside Fairmont Crest at all, but already inside its safest places, hearing its most private conversations, exploiting its smallest misunderstandings to break apart every link in the chain of the man hunting it. Jacob began to suspect that Plasma King did not merely want to protect his plasma empire, but was playing an even crueler game, forcing the undercover officer to destroy everything around himself before being eliminated. If that was true, then Naomi was not collateral damage. She was the perfect indirect target. From here on, the story was no longer about whether the marriage could be saved. It became a battle between truth and timing. Donnie had to decide whether she would keep acting out of a mother's fury or finally slow down long enough to see the larger picture. Naomi had to decide whether she would believe the evidence accusing Jacob or trust the human part of him she had once loved so deeply it felt like fate. And Jacob had to make the hardest choice of his life, continue playing the role of the hateful husband in order to protect the secret, or break every protocol, speak the forbidden truth, and accept sacrificing the mission in order to keep Naomi alive. That is also the most beautiful and cruel tragedy in this story. Jacob may never have betrayed Naomi in the way everyone assumed, but he did betray her sense of safety. He left her in the dark for too long, allowed her mother to turn into a warrior ready to attack anyone, and gave the people out there a chance to use his own family as a weapon against him. And Donnie, though driven by maternal love, may also have done exactly what an enemy would want most. Expose Jacob's weakness at the precise moment the network was already beginning to suspect there was an undercover man among them. Naomi, the person who should have been protected, became the center of a battle of wits in which love, truth, and survival were placed on the same cold scale. When the final secrets begin to crack, no one will be able to keep a clean image of themselves. Jacob will have to face the truth that love cannot survive forever beneath layers of disguise. Naomi will have to understand that trust is not destroyed only by physical betrayal, but also worn away by secrets kept in the name of protection. Donnie will have to live with the most painful question a mother can face, whether her rage saved her daughter or pushed the entire family closer to the edge of the abyss. And Plasma King, whether he is a ghost or a familiar face no one ever suspected, will still be there, patiently watching people who think they are making choices, when in truth each of those choices may already have been placed on his chessboard long before. And that is what makes this story feel so suffocatingly haunting. Because sometimes the greatest danger is not a villain drawing near, but the moment you realize he has been close for a very long time, slipping through every misunderstanding, every crack, every unfinished sentence between people in love. The most heartbreaking question may not be whether Jacob can bring down Plasma King, but whether, by the time the truth is finally exposed, Naomi will still recognize the man she once trusted. Or whether all that remains will be a stranger stepping out of the ashes of secrecy. And honestly, that kind of tragedy is what makes a story like this more frightening than any conspiracy, because it reminds us that some battles do not kill people immediately, but are still powerful enough to break their hearts long before any blood is spilled.